President Trump has filed an emergency petition to the Supreme Court to prevent the sentencing that was supposed to happen this Friday.
As you'll remember, earlier this week, the president asked the judge to stay the sentencing due to the fact that his appeal on the presidential immunity issue is ongoing. So said to the judge, you shouldn't continue with proceedings on this until after that is resolved, because the appeals court may throw this whole thing out anyways. The Judge Merchan denied that. He appealed that to the appeals court. They denied that as well. What this means is that President Trump is asking the Supreme Court of the United States to stay the sentencing, to basically say anything moving forward in that disposition of that case, that criminal case, must be put on hold, because an interlocutory appeal, which that's an appeal made by a party in the middle of the proceedings. So an appeal after judgment is what you normally see, but this is something made in the middle, and he has appealed to the appeals court in New York the ruling to not throw out the case. Judge Merchan said that the presidential immunity ruling had no bearing here, and so therefore he was going to continue with sentencing. That is pending at the appeals court, whether or not they will throw out the case. So all the president is doing here is asking the Supreme Court to say, hey, all proceedings must slow down, must pause, while the appeals court in New York decides whether or not this case remains based off the presidential immunity ruling.
This particular appeal is basically down to a flip of a coin. Typically, the Supreme Court is unlikely to take an appeal in a low-ranking felony matter where there is no sentencing, or at least custodial sentencing, contemplated by the judge. However, the big issue for the Supreme Court in terms of its own legacy is whether or not it will uphold its earlier decision granting presidents immunity for official acts. There's extensive evidence in the record showing that Judge Merchan allowed into evidence contested information which dealt with President Trump's official acts while in office. So I think that was a mistake by the trial court. That's number one. Number two, it's important to keep in mind that this is an interlocutory appeal. In other words, the state courts haven't finished their decision-making, and they're unlikely to finish their decision-making in this particular case, in my judgment, for months. And so the Supreme Court will indeed have an incentive to stay out. Lastly, let me make this particular point. Alan Dershowitz argues, however, that many of the liberal members of the Supreme Court may wish to step in and end this lawfare once and for all so Americans can proceed with their business, which is basically the inauguration of Donald Trump on January the 20th, and he can move forward with a clean slate.
They filed to the Supreme Court, and is it the justices making this decision? Are they coming together like they would for a regular case and having a discussion? Is this assigned to somebody? How does that work in terms of who's making the final decision? Because obviously, even in our comments, I'm seeing people go, well, this justice clearly is not going to vote that way, but hey, this one could. So how does that all come together?
So in this particular case, Judge Sotomayor, one of the liberal justices, has been assigned to this particular case. And so some of our listeners have noted that she is unlikely to vote in favor of Donald Trump. However, since this is a fairly momentous decision and it will have precedential value going forward, she may wish to invite, if you will, all of the members of the Supreme Court into this particular decision so they can take collective blame or praise.
Yeah, I get that. That's good leadership.
And so I think she will probably defer to the entire court before rendering a final judgment.
There's really three things that we could see come out of this. One, Justice Sotomayor could rule on a stay by herself. And so therefore, because of the way each justice is assigned one of the appellate jurisdictions. And so this is where Justice Sotomayor receives these appeals, these asks for stay and things of that nature. So that's just by the nature of where the court case was. It wasn't luck of the draw. Right. It's just the normal path through the appellate process. Right. She could decide to issue a stay on her own. She can refer, as you mentioned, to the entire Supreme Court to see if they can shoulder some of the blame or praise, as you mentioned there. Or also, they're not required to do anything as well. Right. They could, especially with a Friday deadline, she can get the reply tomorrow and still not do anything. And Absolutely. Then the time period dissolves on its own, and the Supreme Court just sat on their hands, which in many cases, when you ask for a stay of this nature, they don't respond, especially when it is, as you referred to, normally in the normal course of jurisprudence, a relatively minor issue for the Supreme Court, something wouldn't typically even make it that far up. But because of all the context, it being a president-elect, a former president, all of those issues, a presidential immunity ruling, that I feel like there's at least a little bit more likelihood of some sort of response. But that also, that interlocutory appeal issue, Supreme Court tends to not get involved until final judgment, final appeals judgment has gone through. That you even remember the 14th Amendment case. They didn't step in until the Colorado Supreme Court. It had gone through the lower level, the appellate level, and then the Supreme Court of Colorado had to weigh in before they even jumped in. So as we said, we don't have a lot of answers, but it does feel like there are a lot of options for the Supreme Court to take here.
There are tons of options, and certainly the coward's way out, you might say, is for the Supreme Court to do nothing. Just sit on their hands and allow the sentencing to move forward. They may, however, wish to intervene. Why? Because it involves the President of the United States, number one, and then number two, it involves their own decision-making. I think it is crystal clear as well that President Trump can adduce evidence showing that Judge Merchan allowed official acts to be brought before the jurors in this particular case. That then taints his sentencing decision, even if it's a non-custodial decision. So there's an argument to be made in favor of the Supreme Court intervening, but I would not bet my last dollar on it.